In the harsh winter of 1887, when the American frontier still held its breath against the unknown, two souls from different worlds were about to discover that sometimes survival requires more than just staying alive. It requires learning to trust again. Margaret O'Brien had fled the Emerald Hills of Dublin with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a mail-order bride contract that promised a new life in Wyoming territory. Behind her lay the ashes of her family's fortune, gambled away by a father who would have sold her to the highest bidder to pay his debts. Ahead lay the unknown, a sheriff named Jake Mitchell, who had written of loneliness in letters that spoke of honor and hope. Jake Mitchell had worn the badge in Silverbrook, Wyoming for 3 years, keeping the peace in a town that balanced precariously between civilization and chaos. His heart bore the scars of betrayal, a fiancée who had chosen gold over love, leaving him to question whether any woman could see past his modest sheriff's salary to the man beneath. In desperation and loneliness, he had placed an advertisement for a wife, never imagining the woman who would answer would arrive just as nature itself prepared to test them both. What neither Margaret nor Jake knew was that the winter of 1887 would become legend, a season so brutal it would reshape the very landscape of the West. And in the crucible of survival, two damaged hearts would discover that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are forged not in comfort, but in the fierce determination to live another day. The train's whistle cut through the October afternoon like a knife through silk, its mournful cry echoing across the vast Wyoming landscape as Margaret O'Brien pressed her face to the frost-kissed window. 3 days of travel had brought her from the cobblestone streets of Dublin to this endless expanse of golden prairie, where the skies stretched so wide it made her feel both infinite and impossibly small. "Silverbrook," the conductor called, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "End of the line." Margaret's fingers trembled as she gathered her belongings, a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her mother, a small trunk containing the remnants of her former life, and the carefully folded letter that had changed everything. Sheriff Jake Mitchell's correspondence had been proper, even kind, speaking of a town that needed a school teacher and a man who needed a wife. His words had painted pictures of mountain sunsets and a life built on honest work, far from the gambling halls and debt collectors that had destroyed her family. The platform was nearly empty when she stepped down, her boots clicking against the weathered wood. The air bit at her cheeks with a sharpness she hadn't expected. October in Ireland was damp and mild, but here the wind carried the promise of winter with aggressive certainty. She pulled her green wool coat closer and searched the handful of waiting figures for a man who matched the description in his letters. Tall, brown hair, badge on his chest. She found him leaning against a wooden post, his hat pulled low against the wind. Jake Mitchell was indeed tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical work and a face that seemed carved from the same rough stone as the distant mountains. But it was his eyes that caught her, pale blue like winter ice, holding a wariness that matched her own. "Miss O'Brien." His voice was deeper than she had imagined, carrying the slow drawl of the American West. "Sheriff Mitchell." She offered a small curtsy, a habit from her former life that felt suddenly foolish on this frontier platform. He straightened, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of autumn wheat. "Welcome to Silverbrook. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Before she could answer, a gust of wind sent her skirts whipping around her legs and scattered the first snowflakes of the season across the platform. Jake's eyes moved skyward, his expression shifting from polite welcome to something approaching concern. "Snow," he said, as if the word itself carried weight. "Early this year." Margaret followed his gaze to the darkening sky, where clouds gathered with ominous intent. "Is that unusual?" "Very." Jake reached for her trunk, his movements efficient but not ungentlemanly. "Old-timers have been predicting a hard winter, but this—" he shook his head. "This is October. We don't usually see snow until December." The town of Silverbrook stretched before them like a carefully arranged stage set, a main street lined with wooden buildings, their painted signs promising everything from dry goods to salvation. The mountains rose beyond like sleeping giants, their peaks already white with snow that no longer seemed distant or romantic. Jake's wagon waited at the end of the platform, a sturdy affair that spoke of practicality over comfort. He helped her up to the seat, his hands strong and sure, and she found herself studying his profile as he gathered the reins. There was something solid about him, like bedrock beneath shifting soil, but also something guarded, as if he expected disappointment around every corner. "The boarding house isn't much," he said as they rolled down the main street, "but Mrs. Henderson keeps it clean and the meals are decent. I thought you might want a few days to settle in before we discuss arrangements." The word arrangements hung between them like a question neither was ready to answer. Margaret nodded, watching the townspeople hurry past with their collars turned up against the wind. A few stared openly at her, and she wondered what stories they were already writing in their minds about the Irish woman who had come to marry their sheriff. "Tell me about the town," she said, as much to break the silence as from genuine curiosity. Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly. "About 200 souls when everyone's accounted for. We've got a general store, a church, a saloon that stays mostly peaceful, and a school that's been without a teacher since Miss Winters married the preacher last spring." He glanced at her sideways. "Your letters mentioned you had teaching experience." "In Dublin, yes. My father, before things became difficult, I taught at a young ladies' academy." The words carried the taste of ash, memories of a life that felt like someone else's story. Things became difficult? There was no judgment in his voice, only the careful tone of a man accustomed to hearing hard truths. Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Finally she spoke, her Irish accent softening the harsh edges of her words. "My father had a weakness for cards and a talent for losing. When the creditors came, they took everything, the house, the furniture, even my mother's jewelry. There was talk of other arrangements to settle the debts." She turned to look at him directly. "I chose this instead." Jake nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. And you, Sheriff? What led you to seek a wife through the mail?" A muscle tightened in his jaw. "This is a hard country for a man alone. I thought—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought it might be easier to be honest about intentions from the start. No false promises or pretty lies." There was pain in those words, Margaret realized, the kind that came from betrayal. She found herself wondering what woman had been foolish enough to hurt a man who spoke of honesty like a sacred thing. The first fat snowflakes began to fall in earnest as they pulled up before Henderson's boarding house, a two-story building that looked solid and welcoming despite its plain facade. Mrs. Henderson herself emerged as if she had been watching for them, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and the no-nonsense manner of someone accustomed to taking care of others. "Land sakes, Jake, you brought her just in time," Mrs. Henderson said, bustling down the front steps. "This snow means business. I can feel it in my bones." Jake lifted Margaret's trunk from the wagon with ease, but his expression remained troubled as he watched the snow begin to accumulate on the ground with alarming speed. "How long since you've seen snow this early, Mrs. Henderson?" "Never," the older woman said flatly. "And I've lived in Wyoming territory for 37 years. She turned to Margaret with a warm smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "Come inside, dear. Let's get you settled before this weather turns ugly." As they climbed the steps to the boarding house, Margaret felt the weight of Jake's gaze on her back. She turned at the doorway to find him still standing beside his wagon, snowflakes gathering on his hat and shoulders like tiny messengers of doom. "Sheriff," she called out, surprising herself with her boldness, "will you come for dinner tomorrow?" "So we might discuss those arrangements?" Something shifted in his winter-pale eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first fragile tendril of hope. "I'd like that, Miss O'Brien." "Margaret," she corrected, "if we're to be discussing marriage, perhaps we should use our given names." "Margaret," he repeated, and the way he said it, slow and careful like a prayer, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I'm Jake." The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that turned the world soft and white around the edges. Margaret watched Jake climb back into his wagon and drive away, his figure growing dim through the curtain of snow until he disappeared entirely. "He's a good man," Mrs. Henderson said quietly beside her. "Had his heart broken a few years back, but he's a good man." Margaret nodded, still watching the empty street. "I hope we can be good for each other." In this country, Mrs. Henderson said, ushering her inside where warmth and lamplight waited, sometimes that's the best kind of love there is. As the door closed behind them, neither woman could have imagined that the gentle snowfall outside was the first whisper of a winter that would test every soul in Silverbrook, forcing strangers to become family and revealing the true strength that lay hidden in the human heart. The snow continued to fall through the night, and by morning the world had changed. Margaret woke to a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. She pushed aside the thin curtains of her boarding house window and gasped. Where yesterday there had been a main street lined with wooden buildings, now there was only white snow piled so high it reached the bottom of the first-floor windows, transforming Silverbrook into something from a fairy tale. "Well, I'll be damned," came Mrs. Henderson's voice from the hallway. "Pardon my language, dear, but I've never seen the like." Margaret dressed quickly in her warmest wool dress and hurried downstairs to find the boarding house's common room filled with worried voices. 3 other guests had been trapped by the unexpected storm. A traveling salesman named Peter Marsh, an elderly couple called the Weatherbys who had been visiting their son, and now Margaret, all staring out the windows at a world transformed. "Door won't budge," reported Mr. Weatherby, a thin man with kind eyes and worried hands. "Snow's packed against it solid." Mrs. Henderson poured coffee with steady hands despite the circumstances. "Jake will dig us out soon enough. He'll check on everyone in town before he sees to his own comfort." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of shoveling outside. Through the frost-etched window, Margaret could see a figure working methodically to clear a path to the front door. Jake, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he moved snow that came up to his chest. It took him nearly an hour to reach the door, and when Mrs. Henderson finally pulled it open, he stood framed in the entrance like some winter warrior, snow clinging to his coat and hat, his cheeks red with cold and exertion. "Everyone all right in here?" he asked, stomping his boots before entering. "Right as rain," Mrs. Henderson assured him, though her eyes held worry. "What's the situation in town?" Jake accepted the cup of coffee she pressed into his hands gratefully. "Bad. The Cornelius family is snowed in completely. Their house sits low, and the drifts are over the roof. The Parkers' chimney is blocked, and they've got a new baby. Doc Williams is trapped at his office, and the general store." He shook his head. "Old Henrik's probably got enough supplies to last the winter, but no way to get them to folks who need them." "What about the train?" asked Mr. Marsh, anxiety making his voice higher than usual. "I was supposed to be in Cheyenne by Wednesday." Jake's expression was grim. "Tracks are buried. Telegraph lines are down. We're on our own until this clears." Margaret found herself studying Jake's face as he talked, noting the way he automatically took responsibility for the town's welfare. The calm authority in his voice despite the dire circumstances. This was a man accustomed to crisis, she realized, someone who others turned to when the world went sideways. "What do you need us to do?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Jake's pale eyes found hers across the warm room. "Can't ask civilians to—" "You're not asking," Margaret interrupted, her Irish accent lending firmness to her words. "I'm offering. In Dublin, when the floods came, everyone helped everyone. I imagine it's the same here." Something like approval flickered in Jake's expression. "Mrs. Henderson, could you spare some food? Blankets? The Cornelius family will need both. And if I can get to them—" "Of course," the older woman said immediately. "Margaret, dear, would you help me pack some supplies?" As they worked, filling baskets with bread, preserves, and thick quilts, Margaret found herself partnering naturally with Jake. He would appear in the kitchen doorway, snow still melting from his coat, and without words they would coordinate. He would carry what was heavy, she would bundle what was fragile, both of them moving with an efficiency that felt oddly familiar, despite having known each other less than a day. "You don't have to do this," Jake said during one of his brief warming breaks, watching her wrap jars of preserves in cloth to prevent breaking. "Yes, I do," Margaret replied simply. "These people will be my neighbors. In Dublin, my grandmother used to say that you don't wait for crisis to pass before you start helping. You help so that people can survive the crisis." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She survived the potato famine," Margaret said, securing the last jar. She knew something about endurance. The day passed in a blur of organized rescue efforts. Jake would disappear into the white wilderness with supplies, returning hours later, exhausted and snow-covered, but carrying reports of families reached, crises averted, small victories against the storm. Margaret found herself appointed as his unofficial quartermaster, helping Mrs. Henderson coordinate food and supplies, tracking which families had been reached and which still needed assistance. By evening, they had managed to get supplies to 5 trapped families, but Jake's movements were growing slower, his face drawn with fatigue that went bone deep. "You need to rest," Margaret told him as he sat in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, mechanically eating stew while snow continued to fall outside. "Can't," Jake said simply. "The Morrison family is still cut off, and old Mr. Henley lives alone on the far side of town. If his fire goes out—" "Then we'll go together tomorrow," Margaret said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Jake looked up sharply. "It's too dangerous for what? A woman?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "I've been helping all day and you haven't complained about my usefulness yet." "That's different. This is what, exactly?" Margaret stood, her hands on her hips in a gesture that would have made her Dublin grandmother proud. "More dangerous than staying in a city where men would sell their daughters to pay gambling debts? More frightening than crossing an ocean alone to marry a stranger?" Jake stared at her, and Margaret realized she was breathing hard, months of suppressed fear and anger finally finding their voice. "I didn't come to Wyoming to hide in boarding houses while good people freeze," she continued, her voice softer, but no less determined. "I came here to build a life. And if that life includes helping my neighbors survive a crisis, then that's what I'll do." For a long moment, the kitchen was silent, except for the wind howling outside and the gentle bubble of stew on the stove. Then Jake nodded slowly. "We'll need snowshoes," he said, "and extra blankets. The Morrison place is nearly 2 miles, and if the wind picks up—" "I'll be ready," Margaret promised. Mrs. Henderson, who had been pretending not to listen while she cleaned dishes, smiled quietly to herself. She had seen plenty of arranged marriages in her time on the frontier, some that grew into love and others that remained polite partnerships. But she had rarely seen 2 people find their rhythm so quickly, moving around each other with the kind of natural coordination that spoke of deeper compatibility. As the evening wore on and the other guests retired to their rooms, Margaret found herself alone with Jake in the common room, both of them too wound up from the day's exertions to sleep. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, and outside the wind continued its relentless assault on the transformed world. "Tell me about your life before," Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Before the troubles." Margaret was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of loss. "We had a house in Dublin with 7 rooms and a garden where my mother grew roses. I taught at Miss Whitmore's Academy for young ladies. French, literature, a little music. I thought I would marry the banker's son and have children who would never know hunger or want." She smiled sadly. "It's strange how quickly a life can disappear." "What made you choose Wyoming? Out of all the places you could have gone—" "Your letters," Margaret said simply. "They were honest. You didn't promise riches or easy comfort. You wrote about building something real, something that would last." She turned to look at him directly. "In Dublin, men made me pretty promises to get what they wanted. You made me true ones." Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "I'm not sure how true they were. I promised you a life in a civilized town with modern conveniences. Instead, you're here on your 2nd day helping me dig neighbors out of snowdrifts. Is that what you think disappoints me?" Margaret's voice held genuine surprise. "Jake, in Dublin I was a commodity to be traded for my father's debts. Here I'm useful. I'm helping save lives. Do you have any idea how precious that feels?" Jake studied her face in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw, the fierce intelligence in her green eyes, the way she sat straight back despite the exhaustion he knew she must feel. This was not the fragile, decorative wife he had half expected. This was a woman forged in her own fires, tempered by loss and strengthened by survival. "I should probably tell you," he said carefully, "that sheriff's work doesn't pay much. The house I have is small, Just 3 rooms and a kitchen. I've got some savings, but nothing that would keep you in the style you were raised to." Margaret's laugh was soft but genuine. "Jake Mitchell, I own exactly 3 dresses, a coat that's seen better days, and a trunk full of books. I'm not exactly a woman of expensive tastes anymore." "The books," Jake said, seizing on something safe to discuss. "What kind of books?" "Poetry mostly, some novels, a few volumes on natural medicine my grandmother left me." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. She was what people called a wise woman, knew how to set bones, deliver babies, treat fevers with herbs. "I learned some of it before everything changed." Jake filed that information away, recognizing its potential value in a frontier town, often days away from the nearest doctor. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that Margaret O'Brien had depths he hadn't expected, currents of strength and knowledge that ran far below the surface of proper manners and Irish accent. The fire burned lower as they talked, and gradually the conversation shifted from past sorrows to present challenges, then to tentative discussions of future possibilities. They were, Margaret realized, interviewing each other in the most practical way possible, not over dinner and polite conversation, but while planning rescue missions and coordinating crisis response. When they finally climbed the stairs to their separate rooms, the snow was still falling steadily outside, adding to drifts that already seemed impossible. But something had changed between them during the long day and longer evening. They were no longer quite strangers, no longer simply a sheriff and a mail-order bride thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming partners. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of wind and snow, but for the first time since leaving Dublin, she didn't dream of the past. Instead, her dreams were filled with snowshoes and rescue missions, with pale blue eyes and steady hands, with the possibility that sometimes the most unexpected storms could blow you exactly where you belonged. In the morning, they would face the white wilderness together. But tonight, for the first time in months, both Jake and Margaret slept the deep, peaceful sleep of people who knew they were no longer facing the world alone. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had intensified overnight, howling like a living thing around the boarding house and driving snow horizontally across the windows. Margaret woke to a world so white and wild that for a moment she wondered if she was still dreaming. Jake appeared at breakfast looking grim, his winter gear already strapped on and ready. "Train tracks are completely buried," he announced to the worried faces gathered around Mrs. Henderson's dining table. "Telegraph operator managed to get through to Cheyenne before the lines went down completely. This storm stretches from Colorado to Montana. We're truly cut off." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Mr. Marsh, the traveling salesman, went pale. "How long?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Could be days, could be weeks." Jake accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Henderson pressed into his hands, but Margaret noticed he barely tasted it. His mind was already outside in the storm, calculating routes and risks. "The Morrison family is still my priority today. After that, I need to check on the families with small children and the elderly." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said, as she had promised the night before. Jake nodded without argument this time, and Margaret felt a small surge of satisfaction. They had moved past the point where he felt the need to protect her from reality. The snowshoes Jake had found for her were crude affairs, bent wood and leather webbing that had seen better days. But they worked. Margaret had never worn such contraptions before, and her first few steps outside the boarding house were clumsy and uncertain. The snow was deeper than she had imagined possible, reaching past her knees even with the snowshoes distributing her weight. "Stay close," Jake called over the wind, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "The trail markers are buried, and it's easy to get turned around in this." They set out through a world transformed beyond recognition. The familiar shapes of Silverbrook had disappeared beneath sculpted drifts and wind-carved snow formations. What had been Main Street was now a river of white flowing between the snow-buried buildings, marked only by the occasional chimney or roofline poking up like islands in a frozen sea. The wind was brutal, driving ice crystals into any exposed skin and making conversation impossible. Margaret concentrated on following Jake's track, placing her snowshoes carefully in his prints and trying not to think about what would happen if they became separated in the whiteout conditions. It took them nearly 2 hours to travel what should have been a 20-minute walk to the Morrison homestead. When they finally reached the small farmhouse, it was almost completely buried, with only the peak of the roof and the top few feet of the chimney visible above the snow. "They're in there," Jake shouted over the wind, pointing to the thin stream of smoke rising from the buried chimney. "Alive, but trapped." The digging was backbreaking work. For every shovelful of snow they moved, the wind seemed to blow two more into place. Margaret's hands were numb within minutes despite her thick gloves, and her lungs burned from breathing the frigid air. But Jake worked with methodical determination, and she matched his pace, shovel for shovelful. When they finally broke through to a window, they were met by the frightened face of Mrs. Morrison, a young woman with worry-lined eyes and a baby in her arms. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed when she saw them. We didn't know if anyone could reach us." The Morrison family consisted of Tom Morrison, a quiet farmer with calloused hands and kind eyes, his wife Sarah, barely 20 with their 6-month-old son, and Tom's elderly father, who was bedridden with a persistent cough that sounded ominous in the confined space of the buried house. "We're running low on firewood," Tom explained as Jake and Margaret squeezed through the window they had cleared, "and grandfather's breathing has gotten worse since the air got stale." Margaret automatically moved toward the elderly man's bedside, her grandmother's training taking over. His breathing was indeed labored, with a wet rattle that spoke of fluid in the lungs. In Dublin, she would have made a steam tent with hot water and herbs, but here— "Do you have any onions?" she asked Sarah Morrison. "And honey, if you have it." The young woman nodded, hurrying to their small pantry. Margaret found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of tending the sick, boiling water, preparing simple remedies, creating the warm, humid air that would help clear congested lungs. While she worked with the grandfather, Jake and Tom Morrison planned their wood situation. The family supply would last perhaps 2 more days, but their woodshed was buried somewhere under 15 feet of snow, and even if they could find it, getting the wood to the house would be nearly impossible in these conditions. "There's dead timber in the grove behind the house," Tom said, sketching a rough map with his finger on the frost-covered window. "Enough to last the winter if we can get to it." Jake studied the terrain, calculating distances and obstacles. "We can't move enough wood to make a difference in one trip, but if we can get you enough to last a few days, and if the storm breaks—" They worked until late afternoon, Jake and Tom taking turns with the heavy work while Margaret tended the baby and helped Sarah prepare hot meals that would stretch their provisions. The elderly Mr. Morrison's breathing began to ease as the warm, herb-scented air did its work, and by evening he was sleeping peacefully. "You saved his life," Sarah Morrison told Margaret quietly as they prepared to leave. "That cough, I thought we were going to lose him." Margaret felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, the satisfaction of being useful, of applying knowledge that could make a difference between life and death. "Keep the air humid," she instructed. "Boil water on the stove, even when you're not cooking. And if his breathing gets worse again, send Tom for me immediately." The journey back to town in the gathering darkness was even more treacherous than the morning trip. The wind had picked up again, and visibility was reduced to mere feet. Margaret followed Jake through the white maze by pure faith, trusting his sense of direction and his intimate knowledge of the town's layout. When they finally stumbled through the door of Henderson's boarding house, they were both exhausted and half frozen. Mrs. Henderson took one look at them and immediately began issuing orders: hot baths, dry clothes, soup that had been simmering all day. "The Hendricks family sent word," she reported as they thawed out by the fire. "Their roof is starting to sag under the snow load, and Mrs. Patterson from the general store came by. They're running low on lamp oil, and folks are starting to panic about supplies." Jake rubbed his temples wearily. "How many families are we up to now?" 17 that we know of," Mrs. Henderson said grimly, "and that's just the ones who've managed to get word to us." Margaret listened to this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just an inconvenient storm that would pass in a day or two. This was a crisis that could reshape or destroy their entire community. And Jake, as the town's only law enforcement officer, was automatically responsible for coordinating rescue efforts and maintaining morale. "We need to organize this better," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she had fully formed the thought. Both Jake and Mrs. Henderson turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, Margaret stood and began pacing, her mind working quickly. Right now, you're trying to be everywhere at once, but that's not sustainable and it's not efficient. We need to divide the town into sections, assign teams to each area, and create a central communication system. Jake's eyes sharpened with interest. Go on. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house becomes our headquarters. It's centrally located, well supplied, and she already has a reputation as someone people turn to in crisis. We identify the strongest, most capable men in town and assign each one a section to be responsible for. They report back here twice a day with status updates. That's actually brilliant, Mrs. Henderson said slowly, like a military operation, but for civilians. Exactly. Margaret's excitement was growing as the plan took shape in her mind. And we established priorities, families with small children and elderly first, then anyone with medical needs, then general welfare checks. We track supplies and coordinate distribution so everyone gets what they need. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face in the firelight. You've thought about this before, he said finally. This isn't something you just came up with. Margaret nodded. During the Dublin floods, I helped coordinate relief efforts for my district. The principle is the same. You can't save everyone if you try to save everyone at once, but you can save everyone if you approach it systematically. All right, Jake said, decision crystallizing in his voice. Let's do it. Mrs. Henderson, can you get word to the men we'll need? Tell them to be here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. As they planned through the evening, identifying key personnel, mapping out districts, discussing supply allocation, Margaret felt something shift in her relationship with Jake. They were no longer potential spouses getting to know each other. They were partners working toward a common goal. Their minds meshed naturally, each building on the other's ideas, each compensating for the other's blind spots. When they finally climbed the stairs to their separate rooms, the storm was still raging outside with undiminished fury. But inside Henderson's boarding house, something new had been born, a sense of purpose and partnership that had nothing to do with mail-order marriages and everything to do with the fundamental human drive to protect and preserve their community. Margaret fell asleep that night, thinking not of Dublin or her lost past, but of the morning ahead and the work still to be done. Somewhere in the space between crisis and cooperation, between duty and choice, she was beginning to understand that love might not always announce itself with flowers and poetry. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the steady rhythm of shared labor, and the unspoken trust between two people facing impossible odds together. The storm showed no signs of stopping, but Margaret O'Brien and Jake Mitchell were no longer simply enduring it. They were fighting back, one rescued family at a time. The third day dawned with an eerie stillness that felt more ominous than the howling winds that had preceded it. Margaret woke to find Jake already gone from the boarding house, out checking on the volunteer teams they had organized the day before. The systematic approach was working. They had successfully reached 12 more families and established a communication network that allowed them to track the status of nearly everyone in Silverbrook. But as Margaret helped Mrs. Henderson prepare breakfast for their expanding group of refugees, 3 more families had been brought to the boarding house when their homes became uninhabitable. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were balanced on the edge of a precipice. "Snow's stopped falling," observed Mr. Weatherby from his post at the window. "Maybe the worst is over." Mrs. Henderson exchanged a meaningful look with Margaret. Both women had lived through enough hardships to know that sometimes the worst came not during the storm, but after it. Jake's return at mid-morning confirmed their fears. His expression was grim as he stomped snow from his boots and accepted the hot coffee that had become their ritual offering. "Henderson's general store took damage in the night," he announced without preamble. "Part of the roof collapsed under the snow load. Henrik estimates he's lost about a third of his winter food supplies." The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Henderson's was the only general store in Silverbrook, and their stock was what would carry the town through the winter months when supply trains couldn't get through. "How much food do we have left?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Enough for maybe 2 weeks if we ration carefully," Jake said. 3 weeks if we're willing to get very hungry." Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife who had taken refuge at the boarding house, spoke up with tears in her voice. "Henrik's talking about loading up what supplies we can save, and heading south to Cheyenne. He says there's no point in staying if we're all going to starve anyway. That's panic talking, Jake said firmly. We're not going to starve, but we are going to have to be smart about this. Margaret felt her mind racing, applying the same systematic thinking that had worked for organizing rescue efforts. What food sources do we have besides the general store? Jake ticked them off on his fingers. Most families put up vegetables from their gardens last summer. There's game in the mountains, if we can get to it through the snow. Some folks have chickens, though most of the coops are buried. And he paused, looking thoughtful. Old Murphy claims he knows where to find fish under the ice, even in winter. Then that's what we do, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. We pool resources, organize hunting and fishing parties, and make sure everyone contributes what they can. It sounded simple when she said it, but the reality proved far more complex. Getting to the frozen creek where Murphy insisted fish could be caught required digging through 6 feet of snow and cutting through ice nearly a foot thick. The hunting parties Jake organized had to venture far up into the mountains, where the risk of avalanche was constant and the cold could kill in minutes. Margaret found herself appointed as the unofficial coordinator of food distribution, a role that required equal parts mathematics, diplomacy, and iron will. Families were understandably reluctant to give up their private stores for the common good, and she spent hours visiting homes, explaining the situation, and somehow convincing frightened people to trust in collective survival over individual hoarding. Mrs. Carmichael, she said patiently to an elderly widow who clutched her remaining jar of preserves like a lifeline, I understand your fear, but if we all keep our supplies to ourselves, some families will starve while others have plenty. If we pool everything and ration it fairly, we all survive. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that she was still an outsider, the Irish mail-order bride who had arrived just days before disaster struck. Some people questioned her authority, others resented her perceived intrusion into family affairs. But Margaret persevered, drawing on reserves of patience and determination she hadn't known she possessed. Jake, meanwhile, had thrown himself into the hunting and fishing operations with characteristic intensity. He would disappear before dawn with teams of volunteers, returning hours later with whatever they had managed to catch or kill, sometimes a deer or elk that had wandered down from the mountains seeking shelter, more often rabbits or fish that provided protein but little bulk. The work was dangerous and exhausting. On the 4th day of their organized efforts, young Tommy Patterson fell through thin ice while fishing and nearly drowned before Jake could pull him out. On the 6th day, a hunting party was caught in a sudden squall and spent a terrifying night huddled in a makeshift shelter, arriving back in town frost-bitten but alive. But gradually their system began to work. The central kitchen at Henderson's boarding house became the heart of Silverbrook's survival network, with families taking turns cooking communal meals that stretched ingredients as far as possible. Margaret's grandmother's knowledge of medicinal herbs proved invaluable when people began suffering from malnutrition: dandelion root for liver function, rose hip tea for vitamin deficiency, willow bark for the aches and pains that came from constant cold and poor diet. You're keeping us alive, Jake told her one evening as they sat by the fire, both too tired to do anything but stare at the flames and try to absorb some warmth into their perpetually cold bones. We're keeping each other alive, Margaret corrected. This isn't something any one person could do alone. Jake studied her profile in the firelight, noting the new lines of exhaustion around her eyes. The way her hands had become rough and chapped from constant work. When you answered my letter, he said quietly, I thought I was getting a wife who would keep house and maybe teach school. I never imagined. What? Margaret turned to look at him directly. That you were getting someone who could organize a survival operation? That I was getting someone who could lead, Jake said simply. Half the families in this town look to you now for guidance. They trust your judgment more than they trust mine, and I've been sheriff here for 3 years. Margaret was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. In Dublin, my father always said I was too headstrong, too willing to speak my mind. He thought it would make me unmarriageable. Your father, Jake said with feeling, was an idiot. Margaret's laugh was soft but genuine, the first real laughter she had managed in days. That's not very charitable, Sheriff Mitchell. Maybe not, but it's true. Jake leaned forward, his pale eyes serious. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten with anxiety. What is it? Are you staying because you want to, or because you're trapped here by circumstances? Because when this is over, when the trains are running again, and you could leave if you wanted to, he paused, struggling with words. I need to know if you're choosing this life, or if it's just choosing you. Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake began to fear he had his answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than emotional. Do you know what I thought about most during the voyage from Dublin? She asked. I thought about control, about how my father's choices had taken away every option I might have had, left me with nothing but the choice between one stranger and another. I felt like a piece on a chessboard, moved around by forces I couldn't influence. Jake nodded, understanding that feeling all too well. But here, Margaret continued, even in the middle of this crisis, I feel like I have agency again. Like my choices matter, my actions have consequences that I can see and measure. When I convince Mrs. Carmichael to share her preserves, or when I help treat Mr. Morrison's father, or when I work with you to organize rescue efforts, I'm not a commodity anymore. I'm a person with skills and judgment and value. She turned to meet his eyes directly. So to answer your question, I'm staying because I choose to stay. Not because I have to, but because this, she gestured around the boarding house, encompassing the sleeping families and the warmth they had created together. This feels like home in a way Dublin never did. Jake felt something tight in his chest release, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Even though it's hard, even though we might be facing weeks more of this, especially because it's hard, Margaret said firmly. Easy things don't test who you really are. They don't show you what you're capable of. I've learned more about myself in the past week than I did in 23 years of comfortable living. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn lower and listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around them. Soft breathing from the adjoining rooms, the creak of wood expanding and contracting in the cold, the ever-present whisper of wind outside. There's something else, Jake said eventually. Something I should probably tell you. Margaret raised an eyebrow, waiting. When I placed that advertisement for a wife, Jake said carefully, I thought I was looking for someone quiet and biddable. Someone who would fit into the life I already had without changing anything fundamental. And instead you got someone who reorganized your entire approach to crisis management. Instead, I got someone who made me realize that the life I thought I wanted was smaller than the life I could actually have. Jake's voice was quiet but certain. You've changed everything, Margaret. Not just the way the town runs, but the way I think about what's possible. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Jake, I'm not asking for declarations, he said quickly. I know this isn't the time or place for romance, but I wanted you to know that whatever this partnership is that we've built, whatever it becomes after the crisis passes, I'm grateful for it. For you. Margaret reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, calloused now from constant work, warm despite the cold that seemed to permeate everything. I'm grateful too, she said simply. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them that their ordeal was far from over. But inside Henderson's boarding house, two people who had started as strangers were discovering that sometimes the best partnerships were forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle. The food crisis was far from solved. They still faced weeks of careful rationing in dangerous hunting expeditions. But Margaret and Jake had found something more valuable than easy abundance. They had found the unshakable confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they finally climbed the stairs to their separate rooms, both carried with them the warm certainty that they were no longer simply surviving the storm. They were building something new in its wake, a partnership, a community, and the first fragile foundations of a love strong enough to weather any crisis the frontier could send their way. 2 weeks into their new survival routine, Silverbrook had transformed into something unprecedented in frontier history. a town where individual families had voluntarily surrendered their independence for collective survival. Margaret's systematic approach and Jake's steady leadership had created a network of mutual support that kept everyone alive. But more than that, it had forged bonds between neighbors that would have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. The central kitchen at Henderson's boarding house had become the town's beating heart. Every morning, families would send representatives to collect their daily rations and report on their household status. Every evening, the hunting and fishing parties would return with whatever they had managed to gather, adding to the common stores that Margaret tracked with mathematical precision. "We're actually doing it," Jake said one morning as he reviewed Margaret's carefully maintained ledgers. "2 more weeks at this rate, and we should make it to spring thaw." Margaret looked up from where she was teaching young Sarah Morrison how to make soup from fish bones and root vegetables, a skill her Dublin grandmother had passed down from harder times. "Don't celebrate yet," she warned, though her eyes held cautious optimism. "We still have the hardest months ahead of us." She was right to be cautious. As January deepened into February, new challenges emerged almost daily. Mrs. Patterson developed a persistent cough that reminded everyone uncomfortably of the early stages of consumption. The Hendricks family's oldest son broke his leg in a hunting accident, requiring Margaret to set the bone with knowledge gleaned from her grandmother's teachings and determination born of necessity. But perhaps the most significant challenge was one that no one had anticipated: the gradual erosion of the social barriers that had defined frontier life. When survival depended on cooperation, the usual hierarchies of wealth, social standing, and gender began to matter less than competence and reliability. Margaret found herself in the unprecedented position of being consulted on matters that would normally be decided exclusively by men. When the hunting parties needed to venture further into dangerous territory, Jake included her in the planning sessions. When families disagreed about resource allocation, they came to her for arbitration. When medical crises arose, people sought her counsel even though the nearest real doctor was buried somewhere under 15 feet of snow. "It's unseemly," complained Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, during one of the evening community meetings. "A woman, and a foreign woman at that, making decisions about how our families should live." "That foreign woman," said Tom Morrison firmly, "saved my father's life and taught my wife how to keep him breathing when his lungs filled up again. I'll take her advice over anyone's." "Mrs. O'Brien has kept detailed records of every family's contributions and needs," added Henrik Patterson, whose general store had become the central distribution point for their pooled resources. "She's been fairer and more efficient than any system we had before." Margaret felt Jake's eyes on her as the debate continued, and when she glanced at him, she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Pride, certainly, but also something deeper, a recognition that the woman he had intended to marry was far more than he had ever imagined possible. The moment that sealed their partnership came during the worst blizzard of the season. It struck without warning on a Tuesday morning when 3 hunting parties were already in the mountains. Jake immediately began organizing rescue efforts, but the wind was so fierce that venturing out seemed like suicide. "We have to wait," urged Doc Williams, who had finally been dug out of his office and brought to the boarding house. "No one can survive in those conditions." "Those are our men out there," Jake said grimly, strapping on his heaviest winter gear. "Tom Morrison, young Billy Hendricks, Murphy and his boys. I'm not leaving them to freeze." "Then I'm coming with you," Margaret said, already reaching for her coat. "Absolutely not. This is what, Jake?" Margaret's voice carried the same steely determination that had convinced frightened families to share their food stores. "Too dangerous for a woman? More dangerous than organizing hunting parties or setting broken bones or managing the survival of an entire town?" Jake started to argue, then stopped. Over the past weeks, Margaret had proven herself in every challenge the frontier had thrown at them. She had earned the right to make her own decisions about risk. "All right," he said quietly, "but we do this my way. You follow my lead, you stay close, and if I tell you to turn back, you turn back. Agreed?" "Agreed." They set out into a world gone mad with wind and snow. The blizzard was unlike anything Margaret had experienced, a living thing that seemed determined to erase every trace of human presence from the landscape. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the cold was so intense it felt like breathing knives. But Margaret had learned to read the landscape over the past weeks, and her systematic mind helped her track their progress even when familiar landmarks disappeared. When Jake's compass failed in the extreme cold, she was able to guide them back to their planned route, using the subtle patterns of snowdrift and wind shadow that had become as familiar to her as Dublin's streets had once been. They found the first hunting party huddled in a makeshift shelter of pine boughs and snow, half frozen but alive. The second group had taken refuge in a cave system that Murphy knew from his prospecting days. The third party, Tom Morrison and two other men, was missing entirely. "Their tracks lead up toward Eagle's Ridge," Jake shouted over the wind, studying the faint traces that were already being obliterated by new snow. "But that's avalanche country. If they went up there—" Margaret studied the terrain, her mind working quickly. "The old mining cabin," she said suddenly. "Tom mentioned it once. Said his grandfather used it during the Silver Rush. If they knew the storm was coming, they might have headed for shelter there." It was a desperate hope, but it was also the only lead they had. Jake and Margaret pushed higher into the mountains, following instinct and prayer through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. When they finally stumbled upon the half-buried mining cabin, both were near the end of their endurance. Inside, they found Tom Morrison and his companions, cold, hungry, and frightened, but alive. "Margaret!" Tom's voice held disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" "Apparently," Margaret said with a weary smile, "I'm helping rescue foolish men who venture into the mountains during blizzards." The journey back to town was a nightmare of exhaustion and exposure, but they made it. All of them made it. And when they stumbled through the doors of Henderson's boarding house, carried inside by willing hands and surrounded by tears of relief and joy, Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the mail-order bride from Dublin, the outsider who had arrived at an inconvenient time. She was Margaret O'Brien Mitchell. Though no formal ceremony had yet taken place, the town had already accepted her as Jake's partner in every sense that mattered. "You saved them," Sarah Morrison whispered as Margaret sat by the fire, slowly thawing out and trying to convince her body that she was truly safe and warm. "You and Jake, you brought our men home." "We brought each other home," Margaret corrected gently. But as she said it, she realized how true those words were. Somewhere on the treacherous mountain pass, somewhere in the space between crisis and cooperation, she and Jake had stopped being strangers, thrown together by circumstance and become something stronger. A team, a partnership, a unit that was greater than the sum of its parts. That night, as the boarding house settled into sleep around them, Jake found Margaret sitting in the common room, staring into the dying fire. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "About what?" "About answering my advertisement. About coming to Wyoming. About ... He gestured vaguely, encompassing their entire impossible situation. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering his question seriously. "In Dublin," she said finally, "I had a comfortable life that felt like a cage. Here I have a hard life that feels like freedom. No, Jake, I don't have regrets. Even though I promised you a quiet life as a sheriff's wife, and instead you're coordinating survival operations and climbing mountains in blizzards." Margaret's laugh was soft but genuine. "Especially because of that. Do you know what I realized today, up on that mountain?" Jake shook his head, waiting. "I realized that I've never been more myself than I am here, with you, in the middle of this impossible situation. Every skill I possess, every bit of knowledge I've accumulated, every ounce of strength I didn't know I had, it all matters here. I matter here." Jake reached across the space between them and took her hand, no longer cold but strong and capable, marked now by the honest work of survival. "You matter to me," he said simply, "not because I need someone to cook and clean and bear children, but because you make me better than I thought I could be." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming recognition of finding exactly where she belonged. "Jake, marry me," he said quietly. Not because it's what we planned, not because circumstances have thrown us together, but because I can't imagine facing whatever comes next without you beside me. Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you, but... Jake raised an eyebrow, waiting for the condition he could hear in her voice. But I want us to be clear about what we're choosing, Margaret continued. I'm not marrying the sheriff who placed an advertisement for a quiet, obedient wife. You're not marrying the desperate immigrant who answered it. We're marrying the people we've discovered we actually are, together, in the crucible of this winter. Jake's smile was slow and sure, transforming his usually serious face. I wouldn't have it any other way. Outside, the blizzard was finally beginning to weaken, and through the frost-covered windows, the first faint stars could be seen appearing in the clearing sky. Spring was still weeks away, but for the first time since the great storm began, it felt truly possible that they would all survive to see it. Margaret and Jake sat together by the dying fire, planning not just their survival through the remaining winter weeks, but their life together in whatever world would emerge when the snow finally melted. They had found something rare and precious, a love forged not in easy times, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. The mail-order bride and the lonely sheriff were gone, replaced by partners who had chosen each other with full knowledge of both their strengths and their limitations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, in frontier life, there would always be challenges. They would face them as they had learned to face everything, together, systematically, and with absolute faith in their combined strength. The worst was not yet over, but they had proven to themselves and their community that they were equal to whatever the frontier could send their way. United, they would not merely survive, they would thrive. March arrived with deceptive gentleness. 3 days of warming temperatures and bright sunshine that fooled everyone into believing winter's grip was finally loosening. Children played outside for the first time in months. Families began talking about spring planting, and the general mood in Silverbrook lifted from grim endurance to cautious optimism. Margaret spent those precious mild days working with Dr. Williams to assess the town's health after their ordeal. Most families had survived the winter in remarkably good condition, thanks to their systematic approach to nutrition and medical care. But everyone was thinner than they should be, and the psychological toll of months of isolation was beginning to show in frayed tempers and nervous exhaustion. We're going to make it, Doctor, Williams told her as they finished their rounds on the third warm day. Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the train routes will reopen. Fresh supplies, mail from the outside world, normal life again. Margaret nodded, but something nagged at her, a sense of unfinished business, of challenges not yet fully met. Her grandmother used to say that the Irish could smell weather in their bones, and something in the air felt ominous despite the sunshine. Jake found her that evening sitting on the front porch of Henderson's boarding house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Worried about something? He asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench that had become their unofficial meeting place. The weather, Margaret said simply. It feels too good to be true. Jake followed her gaze to the serene landscape, where melting snow had begun to reveal patches of brown grass and the first tentative green shoots of early spring flowers. Sometimes good things happen, Margaret. Sometimes winter actually ends when it's supposed to. Maybe, Margaret said, but her voice held doubt. Or maybe this is just the pause before the final test. Jake studied her profile in the fading light, noting the instinctive wariness that months of frontier living had carved into her features. You've been listening to the old-timers again, haven't you? Margaret smiled despite her concerns. Mrs. Carmichael says her joints are aching worse than they have all winter. Murphy claims his weather-sensing skills are better than any barometer, and he's been muttering about the calm before the storm for 2 days. Folk wisdom, Jake said gently, not scientific fact. Folk wisdom, Margaret countered, is how people survive in places where scientific fact isn't available. And everyone who's lived in Wyoming for more than a decade is nervous about this warm spell. Jake was about to argue when a rider appeared on the horizon, pushing his horse hard toward town. Even at a distance, there was something urgent about the approaching figure that made both Margaret and Jake rise to their feet. The rider proved to be Charlie Dawson, a young rancher from 20 miles south who served as an unofficial messenger between the scattered settlements. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his face held the kind of fear that came from witnessing something beyond normal experience. "Sheriff," he called out before he had even dismounted, "there's a storm coming from the north like nothing I've ever seen. The sky is black as midnight, and the wind, Lord help us, the wind sounds like the world ending." Jake and Margaret exchanged a look that held months of shared experience, reading weather signs and preparing for crisis. Without discussion, they both moved into action with the smooth coordination they had developed over their long winter of cooperation. "How long do we have?" Jake asked Charlie as Margaret mentally cataloged their current supply situation and evacuation procedures. 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky," Charlie panted. "But Sheriff, this isn't like the storms we've been having. This is bigger, meaner. The Hendersons' place took a direct hit from the wind, and there's nothing left but kindling." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. The Henderson Ranch was built to withstand frontier weather. Solid construction designed to last generations. If it had been destroyed by wind alone, "We need to gather everyone immediately," she said, her voice calm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "The boarding house won't be safe if this storm is as bad as Charlie describes." Jake nodded grimly. "The church," he said, "stone construction, low profile, built into the hillside. It's our best bet." What followed was the most intense mobilization effort of their entire crisis. Jake and Margaret split up to cover more ground, each taking teams of volunteers to evacuate families from their homes and bring them to the relative safety of the stone church. They had perhaps 4 hours before the storm hit, and nearly 40 families scattered across the town and surrounding area. Margaret found herself leading the evacuation of the Eastern District, coordinating the movement of the Morrison family, the elderly Mrs. Carmichael, and 6 other households. The systematic approach they had developed over the winter months served them well. Everyone knew their role, everyone understood the priority system, and no one wasted time arguing about procedures. But as they worked, the weather signs became increasingly ominous. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The wind began to howl with a sound unlike anything from their previous storms. Deeper, more sustained, carrying an undertone of destruction that made even the horses nervous. "Margaret!" called Sarah Morrison from the wagon where her family huddled with their essential supplies. "Look at the sky." Margaret followed her pointing finger to the northern horizon and felt her breath catch. A wall of black clouds stretched from east to west as far as the eye could see, towering so high it seemed to scrape the very dome of heaven. Lightning flickered within its depths, not the familiar bright forks of summer thunderstorms, but an eerie, sustained glow that made the entire cloud mass pulse like a living thing. "Move faster!" Margaret called to her teams, but she kept her voice calm and authoritative. Panic would kill them as surely as the storm. "Everyone to the church immediately. Leave anything that isn't essential." The evacuation became a race against time and nature. Families arrived at the stone church in a steady stream, carrying babies and elderly relatives, dragging essential supplies and treasured possessions. Margaret and the other team leaders worked frantically to organize the space, ensuring that everyone had room and that medical supplies were accessible. Jake arrived with the last group just as the first devastating winds hit Silverbrook. The sound was indescribable, like a freight train crossed with the roar of a waterfall, punctuated by the crash of buildings being torn apart. Through the thick stone walls of the church, they could hear the destruction of their town proceeding with methodical thoroughness. "Is everyone accounted for?" Jake shouted over the noise, consulting the list they had used throughout the winter to track every family. Margaret checked her own carefully maintained records, calling out names and receiving confirmation from the huddled groups scattered throughout the church. 43 families, 167 souls total, she reported. "Everyone's here." For the next 18 hours, they huddled in the church while the storm raged outside with unprecedented fury. The thick stone walls vibrated from the constant assault of wind, and several times debris struck the building with impacts that shook dust from the ceiling beams. But the structure held, and the systematic preparation that had characterized their entire winter survival effort ensured that everyone had food, water, and basic medical care. Margaret found herself moving constantly through the crowded space, checking on families, treating minor injuries, and maintaining the morale that would keep nearly 200 people from succumbing to panic. Jake coordinated with the men who took turns monitoring the doors and windows, watching for signs of structural damage and preparing for emergency evacuation if the church itself became unsafe. But as dawn broke and the storm finally began to weaken, it became clear that the building had protected them completely. Exhausted but alive, they began to venture outside to assess the damage to their town. Silverbrook was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but completely erased from the landscape. Where buildings had stood, there were now only scattered boards and empty foundations. The general store, the boarding house, the saloon, the school, all of it swept away as if it had never existed. Margaret stood in what had been Main Street, holding Jake's hand and trying to process the magnitude of the destruction. Months of careful survival, systematic cooperation, and hard-won community bonds. And in 18 hours, the storm had reduced it all to splinters and memories. "What do we do now?" whispered Sarah Morrison, her baby crying in her arms as she stared at the empty space where her home had been. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her. 43 families who had lost everything except their lives, looking to her and Jake for answers they didn't have. For a moment, the magnitude of the challenge threatened to overwhelm her completely. Then Jake squeezed her hand, and she felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried them through every crisis of the long winter. "We rebuild," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the group of survivors. "We've spent months learning how to work together, how to pool resources and support each other. Now we use those skills to build something better than what we lost." "With what?" asked Henrik Patterson, gesturing at the devastation. "We've got nothing left but the clothes on our backs." "We've got each other," Margaret replied. "We've got the knowledge we've gained, the systems we've developed, the trust we've built, and we've got the spring coming, land that's proven it can support a community, railroad access that will return in a few weeks, and the attention that this disaster will bring from territorial authorities." Jake took over, his voice adding the weight of official authority to Margaret's vision. "The territorial government will provide disaster relief. Railroad companies will want to rebuild the depot to maintain their route. And we've proven that this location can support a thriving community even under the worst possible conditions." Over the following hours, as they organized temporary shelter and began cataloging their actual resources, Margaret's vision began to take concrete shape. Instead of simply rebuilding what had been lost, they could design a new Silverbrook from the ground up, incorporating everything they had learned about cooperative resource management, community organization, and frontier survival. The systematic approach that had saved their lives during the winter would now be applied to creating an entirely new kind of frontier town, one built on principles of mutual support and collective planning that were unprecedented in the Western Territories. 3 days after the final storm, as they waited for the first relief trains to arrive from Cheyenne, Jake and Margaret were married by Pastor Williams in a simple ceremony held among the ruins of the old church. They exchanged vows not of romantic love, but of partnership, promising to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the same systematic cooperation and unwavering trust that had carried them through the winter of their lives. "You know," Jake said as they stood together afterward, looking out over the space where they would build their new town, "when I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I thought I was looking for someone to fit into the life I already had. And instead, you got someone who helped you build a completely different life," Margaret finished, smiling up at him. "Are you disappointed?" Jake's answer was a kiss that tasted of hope and possibility, of challenges met and obstacles overcome together. "Margaret Mitchell," he said against her lips, "disappointed is the last thing I am." As spring advanced and the rebuilding began, their story would become legend throughout the Wyoming Territory. The tale of a community that had not merely survived the worst winter in recorded history, but had emerged stronger, more united, and better prepared for whatever challenges the frontier could send their way. The mail-order bride from Dublin and the lonely sheriff from Silverbrook had found something more precious than individual happiness. They had discovered how to build a life and a community based on mutual respect, systematic cooperation, and the unshakable faith that any challenge could be overcome if people worked together with intelligence, determination, and love. In the years that followed, the new Silverbrook became a model for frontier communities throughout the West. Built on the systematic principles Margaret and Jake had developed during their winter of survival, it featured cooperative resource management, community-wide emergency planning, and social structures that prioritize mutual support over individual competition. Margaret established the first territorial school that trained frontier women in both traditional domestic skills and practical survival techniques, emergency medicine, resource management, and community organization. Her students, known throughout Wyoming as Margaret's Girls, carried these skills to communities across the territory, creating a network of prepared, capable women who could turn any crisis into an opportunity for growth and cooperation. Jake served as sheriff of the new Silverbrook for 15 years before being appointed territorial marshal, a position that allowed him to implement Margaret's systematic approach to law enforcement and community building throughout Wyoming. Together, they developed training programs that taught lawmen to see themselves not as enforcers of individual will, but as coordinators of community welfare. Their marriage produced 4 children who grew up understanding that love was not just a feeling, but a daily choice to work together toward common goals. The Mitchell family became synonymous throughout the territory with competence, reliability, and the kind of quiet heroism that builds civilizations one systematic decision at a time. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the proof they provided that the best partnerships, whether in marriage, community, or survival, are built not on romantic ideals or desperate need, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the unshakable commitment to face whatever challenges arise with intelligence, determination, and unwavering faith in each other. The winter of 1887 nearly destroyed Silverbrook, Wyoming. Instead, it forged a love story that would inspire frontier communities for generations to come. A testament to the power of systematic cooperation, practical wisdom, and the simple truth that sometimes the best way to find love is to focus first on building a life worth sharing. Margaret O'Brien had fled Dublin seeking escape from a life that felt like a cage. Jake Mitchell had advertised for a wife to fill the empty spaces in a life that felt incomplete. What they found instead was something neither had imagined possible, a partnership that transformed not just their own lives, but their entire community, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most practical decisions. In the end, their advertisement might have been for a mail-order bride, but what they built together was something far more valuable, a marriage of equals, a community of mutual support, and a legacy of systematic love that would endure long after the last snows of that legendary winter had melted away. What did you think of Margaret and Jake's incredible journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? And have you ever experienced a winter that tested your community the way Silverbrook was tested? Don't forget to subscribe for more historical love stories that prove love can bloom even in the harshest circumstances. What kind of historical romance would you like to see next? Let us know. Your suggestions help us choose our next great adventure.